Hamza. I was going to go, but because of this, I didn't. I want to talk a little bit about it. But I can leave a lot of that to you, I think.
Hang on, say that again about this demolition. Yeah, for sure. And
we've got a little video that we might play after you've all done your main presentations on Hamza that we put on Facebook and Twitter, and then maybe you can say a few words afterwards because you're filming from you're recording.
Yeah, I'm pressing the live now. Good luck.
Hello everyone, welcome to the PAX webinar. What we'll do, we'll just give it a couple more minutes just to make sure that everybody who can join will be able to join, and then I'll run through the agenda, introductions, who we are, the format, a couple of housekeeping rules as well, and then hopefully we will have an interesting and lively debate about some of the things that are happening in the occupied Palestinian territory. So we'll just give it another minute until you all come online. 3 of us are actually here in the occupied Palestinian territory. So we're coming from the field, also from the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. So hopefully we can give you some color and depth to our descriptions today, and some of the sense of reality of what's happening here. And things move very, very quickly. So I'm going to start now. So my name's Shane Stevenson. I'm the country director for Oxfam here in the occupied Palestinian territory. Just to give you a little bit of background on Oxfam activities, we work across the whole territory, East Jerusalem, West Bank and Gaza. We have a turnover of approximately 15 million euros, and we work in washing, sanitation, and direct humanitarian support in cash and food. But we also work on economic development and job creation. We have quite a significant gender program working on women's rights. And across all of that, we have advocacy and lobbying work in hope that we can bring some accountability to what is happening here in the territory. Before I introduce the panelists today, we're excited to introduce to you. Each panelist will have 15 minutes to present. They will go consecutively, so one after another, and then we will have a short film, very short, a minute 30 if it plays okay, and then we'll have the Q&A sessions. So in the Q&A sessions, if you want to raise a question to one of the panelists, please put it in the chat box. If there is a common thread between quite a few of the questions, I'll try and bring it all together and ask the panelists. If there are lots and lots of questions, then I'll have to be selective. What we can do is hopefully Thomas, who's behind the scenes, he's dealing with the IT side of everything here, be able to bring you online, and maybe you can ask your questions directly as well. Let's see how it works in that respect. So we have an hour and a half. It has been recorded, so it'll be shown out there. Please be brief in your questions and everything as possible so we can keep to the time limit. It's very much appreciated. So let me just do a brief introduction of our panelists. So we have Niels Mollema, graduated from Leiden University with a Masters in Crisis and Security Management. After university, he worked for Amnesty International Netherlands and country coordinated Israel, OPC in Iran. Niels then joined Al-Haq as an EU advocacy officer, where he stayed until January 2020. Niels now works for ActionAid based in Amsterdam. So welcome, Niels. Thank you for joining us today. Suhar Junaid is a senior research and advocacy officer with Al-Haq Human Rights Organization in the Legal and Research and Advocacy Department. Her research and advocacy on the areas of gender, environment and climate justice within the context of the occupation, as well as other widespread human rights violations committed against Palestinians. She holds a Master's of Science degree in Climate Change Science and Policy from the University of Sussex in the UK, and a double Bachelor of Arts degree in Gender and Environmental Studies from Trent University in Canada. Sarit Mikhail is currently the International Advocacy Officer for B'Tselem and has been an integral part of B'Tselem staff since October 2004. Before becoming the Internal Advocacy Officer, she was the organisational spokesperson for 12 years. Before joining B'Tselem, she worked extensively in the fields of journalism, graphic design and translation. In addition, she was active in social change movements, both in Israel and internationally, as well as working with the diplomatic community and international civil society groups. Sarit holds a master's degree in gender studies from Birkbeck College, University of London, and BA in graphic design from Camberwell College of Art, the London Institute. So before our seminar today is on shrinking space in Area C. There's lots of different facets of that civil space, as well as the annexation and everything like that. So before we go over to Niels, I just want to read this out that came out from the West Bank Consortium. Israel has further accelerated its alarming high rate of demolitions in 2021, with OCHA data showing at least 78 structures demolished or seized in the West Bank, including 15 donor-funded structures between the 1st of January and the 28th of January, so this year alone. In total, 69 persons were displaced, including 32 children, with a further 687 persons affected. This represents a 73% increase in comparison to the same period in 2020. And what the underriding theme is that demolitions and violence from the settlements towards Palestinians and also incidents in the seam zone and around the wall have actually accelerated over the last few months, and it's been raised in quite a few international forums, and it has been quite a concern. We will also take the opportunity after we've had the presentations to reflect a little bit about what's happening in Hamza. Hamza was the biggest demolition in a decade on the 3rd of November. And Sarit is actually there, having attended an international donor visit. So we'll hopefully be able to reflect on that as well. But for now, that's enough from me. And Niels, you have a 10-minute slot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just quickly share my screen. As was mentioned, I am no longer with Al-Haq, but one of the last bits of work that I did for Al-Haq was working on this report. I'm listed as the author. I think that's a great honor, but I also have to say that there was an incredible amount of work done by much of the other staff, including Suhar, to finalize the report and to bring it out. I spent my time at Al-Haq was mostly spent traveling Europe and informing politicians, diplomats, and other public officials on the situation in Palestine. And I'm happy about a year on to be able to come and present at least a bit of the findings of the report. I'm not going to try to give you a full overview. And at the risk of repeating a lot of the knowledge that people already have, I always feel it's quite necessary to quickly give a bit of an introduction. Hopefully everyone knows what Area C is. Area C was created through the Oslo Accords. It's about 60% of the West Bank. It's under full Israeli control through Kogat, and it should have been handed over to the Palestinian Authority before the turn of the century. It's incredibly resource rich. It holds the majority of agricultural land. And the denied access for much of the Palestinian economy means that it's robbing the Palestinian economy of billions of dollars every year. Shrinking space is obviously why we're here, and part of the reason why we started, at least why I was very interested in the subject, is also because it's something that we see worldwide, and it is a mistake to think that shrinking space is something that is only limited to Israel and Palestine. Even when you just look at the subject matter of Israel and Palestine, it isn't limited to the context of the Israeli government. It's something that we see happen in Europe. We have several dozens of cases across Europe of BDS activists being defamed or pursued for false claims of anti-Semitism. We see the IHRA definition being rolled out and incorporated and abused across the continent. and often we see these same allegations come back to try to harm organizations that are trying to do incredibly good human rights-based work in the area. And when we zoom in to the occupied Palestinian territories, we see, for decades we've seen different tactics used, but many of them remain the same. And they include travel bans, demolitions, torture, administrative detention, home invasions, and then these are just 5 that I can quickly name off the top, but there are many, many, many more. And now for what the report was on is in Area C. For those of you who have not fully read the report, the idea was not to create an exhaustive list. It wasn't an attempt to say, this is exactly how everything works in Area C. It was, there were 3 cases chosen to give you an idea, of 4 cases, sorry, chosen to give you an idea of the types of trends that we see and to put a bit of a face to those trends. So the 4 that we selected are examples of harassment of field workers of human rights organizations, the targeting of medical personnel and the attack of journalists, as well as often attacks by illegal Israeli settlers. Now the statistics that you see behind brackets are only the cases that Al-Haq has documented. Those are not, again, not exhaustive, but it is quite illustrative of the situation. Instead of talking you through what each of these means, I've decided for the sake of this presentation to pick one story out of these that I think is very fitting given the context of what we've seen happen at the Capitol riots, what we've also seen happen in the Netherlands recently with demonstrations at Museumplein against the introduction of an avondklok. I'm struggling with the word of a curfew, sorry, in which journalists were actively attacked and targeted as if they were part, but in this case, by the mob. So I've chosen to tell you the story of one particular photojournalist who, for the sake of this story, we'll call Samir. Everything that I'm going to tell you, I call it a story. It's not a story. It is. It's fully documented, taken under oath, and as well documented as it can be. So at 10:45, Samir was scheduled to start reporting and recording a protest. There were about 100 protesters present. They were there to protest against the wall, the settlements, and the creation of a new settlement outposted by Hama. Present were about 100 protesters. There were 40 to 50 Israeli military present and several settlers as well. Aside from that, there were several journalists there to document the situation. As the protest was going on and as the recording was happening and as Samir was simply doing his job, he started to get harassed by a handful of settlers. Many of these are, in this case, as we often see with settler violence, there is a certain level of protection, or at least it happens under the watchful eye of the Israeli military. And that in this case, that was no different. Only after about a half hour was there any kind of intervention, and not the kind that you'd like to see, but instead the press cards were taken, IDs were taken, and the cameras and car keys were also taken away from the journalists. The cars were then towed away. 4 journalists and 9 foreign solidarity groups that were group members that were also present were ushered onto a bus. At this point, it's about 12:30. That bus was then under military escort taken to a settlement where they arrived at Ariel settlement at about 6 o'clock in the evening. The detainees, the journalists and the protesters were taken away and put in confinement until they faced interrogation. In this case, Samir was waiting till about 12:30 at night to get interrogated. Following a strong interrogation, he was charged with presence in a closed military zone, obstructing the movement of a soldier, and participating in a subversive event. And he was also almost forced to sign a document that he cannot read and cannot verify what it says, as well as his DNA and fingerprints being taken. For those of you who are listening and that are based in the Netherlands, I'd like you to imagine that Xander van der Wulp, one of our most esteemed political correspondents, is at the demonstrations at Museumplein against the curfew, and instead of the police present protecting the journalist and document and making sure that they can do their job, he gets arrested. He gets the claim becomes that he becomes a part of those protests, and that he gets detained, interrogated at 12:30 at night, and then beyond that, he gets dropped off at 3:30 in the morning, not even at the place that they were picked up, not with access to their cars, not with transport home, and not with some kind of registration of the materials that they had and that were confiscated. It makes it impossible to do your job. It makes it impossible to hold people accountable. And it's very simply said, unacceptable. And I'd love to tell you that this is an isolated incident, but even with just the Al-Haq recorded cases, we're talking about roughly one case a week in which this happens. So it's not an anomaly. It's not some kind of outstanding situation. It's pretty much the norm. And it's very, very, very worrying. And it makes any route to fixing a situation becomes impossible when there's no political avenue of expression. And I think that's one of the key messages that we wanted to show is I often hear, and as much as I agree with it, we need peace and we need a solution, but those solutions are taken away very, very actively, and routes to those solutions are taken away extremely actively. And this is only just one of those cases. For that, I mean, this is my presentation. Sarit and Suhar are on the ground and they have a lot more and up-to-date information to give you. But thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Niels. Very sobering story that you said. I mean, civil society space in occupied territories is getting attacked from many, many different directions. We feel it here at Oxfam. We're actually wanting to do a presentation on a gender report from our partners, and it actually got stopped and it had to be postponed for a week. I mean, it's just coming in many, not just journalists. But thank you, Niels, and thanks for sharing the report. And if you can see in the chat box, please take some time to have a look at Al-Haq's report and just take some time to comprehend what the impact it is on the people here. We're just trying to report on what's actually happening so people can be informed, and so policies can be based on decisions and not on the perspectives and ideas. I'm very pleased to introduce Suhar to do the next presentation. So Suhar, over to you.
Thank you, Shane and Niels. I will not be sharing my screen or I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to have kind of a conversation with you. I do have my notes here as well. I'm just going to start by kind of giving an overview of what Al-Haq does, just in order to bring things into perspective here. We work on a lot of different areas, but the backbone of our work is monitoring and documentation of violations, whether these violations are being committed by the Israeli authority, the Israeli occupying authorities, or by the Palestinian authorities. But in this particular case, and as you will see throughout my presentation, I'm going to be perhaps bringing in some examples, particularly from the Jordan Valley area, because the Jordan Valley area is very representative of the systematic policies that are taking place in Area C. 90% of it is classified as Area C, and it is very resource rich. And a lot of these violations committed by the Israeli authorities, the annexationist policies as well, are being committed on a daily basis, on a regular basis in the Jordan Valley area. But this does not mean that this is the only place where we work at. We work in all of Area C. We continue to document and monitor cases there. One of the things that we do as well is we detect trends. So speaking on demolitions, for example, this is one of the things that we document in full. There are two types of demolitions. There are punitive demolitions and administrative demolitions. The demolitions that apply mostly in Area C are administrative demolitions, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit as well. So we document demolitions in full, and this is something that we have noticed, or a trend that we have detected, particularly within the context of this pandemic, is that demolitions have increased in Area C, administrative demolitions, at least, that is. So since the beginning of COVID-19, there was a significant increase in demolitions carried out under Military Order 1797, which allows the demolition of unlicensed structures in Area C, which are deemed as new, within 96 hours after the issuance of a removal notice to be conducted. And this Military Order 1797, and sorry, Sarit, I apologize in advance if some things overlap, but I'm guessing that a lot of things are going to overlap when we're speaking on examples about Area C here. So Military Order 1797, which was issued by the Israeli military commander in the West Bank in 2018, has been on hold since June of 2018. It was issued back in April, pending a decision by Israel's High Court on petition filed by civil society organizations. In late April 2019, the petition was rejected, which paves the way for its enforcement in the upcoming months, or within the months that followed late April of 2019, and severely limited the possibility of challenging demolitions and seizures in Israeli courts, which are the only available legal remedies for Palestinians, basically. And while the world is collectively trying to deal with the spread of a novel pandemic or novel coronavirus, Israel, which is the occupying power, has continued its systemic and widespread campaign of house demolitions in the occupied territory. These policies and practices of demolitions target the protected Palestinian civilian population and are intended to foster what we call a coercive environment in order to force people outside of the area, in order to force their transfer. And despite many efforts to freeze these demolitions during the state of emergency, Palestinian structures have seen large-scale demolitions. Between the 5th of March to the 1st of January 2021, the Israeli occupying authorities demolished 470 structures, including 211 residential structures, of which 166 of which are inhabited structures, so leaving people basically displaced. The demolitions have led to the displacement of around 811 Palestinians, and this is as of the 1st of January of this year. This included 382 children. And beyond homes, other structures, including water, hygiene or sanitation assets, humanitarian infrastructure as well, and other facilities essential for livelihood, including hygiene and sanitation, were demolished by Israel, undermining basically the access of many to livelihoods and services, to basic services. On the 3rd of November of 2020, which was also mentioned by Shane, the demolition and forcible transfer of Khirbet Humsa Al-Fouqa, which is a Palestinian Bedouin community in the Jordan Valley, was carried out, leaving 72 protected Palestinians 38 of which are children, leaving them homeless. And Sarit, please correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers so far. These are the statistics that we have so far. So while the demolition of Khirbat Hamsa is what was quoted as the largest forced displacement incident in over 4 years and the largest single demolition operation conducted by the Israeli civil administration since 2010, in terms of the number of people left homeless, it is just another example of Israel's long-standing policy of forcible transfer of Palestinians. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, as well as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, underlined and highlighted the gravity of the conducted raid and demolition, specifically during a global pandemic. They stated that secure housing is one of the ultimate protections that individuals possess in order to protect themselves against COVID-19. And they also stressed that deliberately creating a homeless population in the midst of an international health catastrophe is a serious human rights blemish on any state authority responsible for such acts, which clearly applies to Israel as well. So Israel's practices of building restrictions and home demolitions, and these building restrictions, by the way, deem it virtually impossible for Palestinians to acquire permits, so virtually impossible for Palestinians to actually legally build. These practices serve a very specific goal, which is creating conditions leading to the forcible transfer of the Palestinian population from the area. This is particularly evident when viewing the many communities that face repeated demolitions by the Israeli civil administration. For example, in 2011, and these are just examples that I'm bringing, there are so many examples that are closer to that date as well. Israeli bulldozers went to Khirbat Tana, for example, to the school of Khirbat Tana, and confiscated a concrete mixer that was being used for the construction of the school. The school was being rebuilt after its demolition by the Israeli occupying authorities in December of 2010. Now, so this targeting of Khirbat Tana as well, also located in Area C, continued in 2016 to the extent that the UN humanitarian coordinator stated that it is hard to see how demolitions like the ones in Khirbat Tana are about anything other than pushing vulnerable Palestinians out of certain parts of the West Bank. The experiences of Khirbat Tana and other villages basically highlight Israel's policies that are aimed, again, at forcibly transferring the Palestinian population outside of Area C for the purpose of expanding Israel's illegal settlement enterprise and forcibly transferring the Palestinian population outside of the area and permanently annexing the land. So these three components, we need to think about them at the same time, in conjunction with each other. In 2016, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon noted that the creation of new facts on the ground through demolitions and settlement building raises questions about whether Israel's ultimate goal is in fact to drive Palestinians out of certain parts of the West Bank. As a result of Israel's illegal practices in Area C, which hinder livelihoods and obstruct the fulfillment of basic needs and create severe living conditions for the Palestinian population, the number of Palestinians has also significantly decreased, particularly in the Jordan Valley. It is estimated that prior to 1967, the population in the Jordan Valley was estimated at 250,000, while we're talking right today about almost 53,000 Palestinians residing therein. As mentioned, demolitions are not restricted to residential structures. They also include structures that are relevant to water and sanitation. And by the way, let's keep in mind that in Area C, all of the Israeli settlements and Israeli settlers are fully connected to the water network and the electric grid, while Palestinians are systematically denied access to these basic resources. Al-Haq's documentation also shows that women are more vulnerable, which is not just Al-Haq's documentation, it's a general conclusion that we can conclude in different parts of the world. But in our documentation, we also found that women are more vulnerable to poor sanitation in situations of home demolitions in particular, especially when they are denied the products and privacy needed to properly manage their personal hygiene, including during menstruation, for example. According to one of the women in Al-Hadidiyya, which is a village located in the northern part of the Jordan Valley, she stated, saying that it was easier for boys and men to wash up with pieces of cloth and water that we women would warm up using fire. But changing clothes retrieved secretly from the location of the demolition structure was more challenging for women and girls due to the lack of private space as well. So we're also talking about the right of privacy here. During interviews also conducted by Al-Haq, another woman stated that her 14-year-old, or I'm going to quote her, "My 14-year-old daughter did not change her clothes, including her underwear, for days." And we're talking about demolition operations here where people are left basically homeless for days at a time in very sometimes extreme weather conditions as well. So she continues by saying that her daughter could not change her clothes, including her underwear, for days. "I told her I would cover her up with my body while she changed, but she was too shy. She refused." When asked about the availability of women's sanitary products, one woman also recalled using pieces of sponge that are retrieved from destroyed mattresses as replacement for sanitary pads, which were unavailable for days following the demolition as well. So the use of negative also hygiene management practices due to the lack of access to water and sanitary resources can be particularly unhygienic for women and girls, directly undermining their right to sanitation, which may be detrimental to their health. So when we're talking about these demolitions, we're talking about impacts on all kinds of rights here. The right to education as well, that comes, the violations to the right to education that comes as a result also on the restrictions on road construction and restrictions on access to healthcare as well, because a lot of these communities are living in remote areas. So when they're not connected to the main roads, to essential services, to essential facilities where these services are provided, these rights are also undermined and hindered. I'm just going to see how I am when it comes to time, in terms of time.
2 more minutes, would that be okay?
Okay. So another practice by which Israel attempts to push Palestinians outside of Area C is the declaration of lands as closed military areas and firing zones. And I assume maybe that Sarit is going to touch on that, but basically, or maybe not, I don't know. But basically also a lot of these communities are residing in areas that are declared as active fire zones and active military areas and military zones. Very extremely dangerous for these communities. Another important annexationist policy that we need to keep in mind always when we're talking about practices in Area C is the establishment and financing of settlements. And as of 2018, the majority of Israeli settlements were reportedly built on land that is declared as state land. And with it comes also the exploitation of natural resources. So in addition to the illegal appropriation of land and the establishment of settlements in the region, Israel has consistently exploited the natural resources of Area C for the benefits of its own citizens, including both settlers and Israelis beyond the Green Line, which is also illegal under international law. Israeli settlers residing in these settlements make extensive use of water and other natural resources, while Palestinians are systematically being denied this access. I think the last thing that I wanted to point out, I mean, there are a lot of other examples that we can give. For example, the use of or the exploitation of water resources by Makirot. The exploitation of natural resources alone is a topic that could be explored a lot more, for sure. But the last thing that I wanted to highlight, which also we have noticed an increase an increased trend is an increase in settler violence. Am I still on? Okay, so a very sharp increase also in settler violence, particularly also during this pandemic and during the beginning of the pandemic. I'm going to stop here because I think I went over my time, but I'm happy to answer any questions if they arise later.
Thank you, Suhar. I mean, just the fact that you condensed so many issues into such a short time frame, and all of those issues could have their own session, from natural resources, settler violence, demolitions, the systematic annexation, the funding of the settlements and everything like that. It's very complex, but when it all comes together, the end result is the same. The Palestinians are squeezed and they've moved on. And as you said, the numbers of Palestinians in the West Bank continues to decrease as well. What I will share is that Oxfam produced a paper on settler violence last year, so I think Thomas can share that with the audience here. But now I'll pass on to Sarit, who is actually at Hamza. Today there was a donor briefing organised by the EU, and hopefully some media turned up, so I'm very interested to know what happened. Oxfam as an organisation did respond to the community there back in November with our own funds. So I'm very keen to know what's going to happen. Sarit.
So maybe I'll just say a little bit about what I'm doing now and then go to the broader kind of issue. And I might first try and show you, I'm sitting in a car, so apologies for the kind of like haphazard nature of this entire thing, but you might be able to see it's still, yeah, it's still light. So if I'm pointing the computer basically in a eastern direction, and you might see these white greenhouses. They belong to an Israeli settlement called Bekaot. And if you see in the distance, beyond or in the hills in the distance, you might see these kind of like small white shapes. That is the beginning of Khirbet Homsa that was demolished, so many times. Once in November, just, coincidentally or not, who knows, on the day that the US was going ahead and voting in the elections. And then again on Monday, so this Monday, and then once activists and international aid organizations arrived at the scene and supplied additional humanitarian assistance, the Israeli authorities, the civil administration arrived again and demolished even beyond just demolished, also confiscated the humanitarian assistance that was provided. So today, there was a very large visit there by the European Union heads of missions. So the EU effectively ambassadors to Palestine visited the area together with the Palestinian Prime Minister who came as well, and various other Palestinian Authority officials. It seems to me, and this is my personal interpretation, right? I'm not clearly an expert on this. It seems to me that the Palestinian Authority has decided to really raise the issue of the demolition of Homsa, really invest a lot of resources in like a protective presence here. There are Palestinian Authority and also other Palestinian activists here all the time. People have been sleeping here, a bit like what we saw in Khan al-Ahmar during the period where there was a risk of demolition here. So it'll be interesting to see if all of this investment of PA resources, both physically bringing additional assistance, but also sending the people and the support and the solidarity, is whether that is actually going to be making, make a difference in terms of the community's ability to really remain here. Because it seems currently, based on what we've seen over the last few days, that the Israeli authorities' policy or intention, and I'm being very careful here because of course we don't know what their intention is. Our assessment of what they want to do on the basis of what they have done on the ground is to literally demolish and confiscate everything that is being rebuilt and not allow people to really exist here. And like Suhar was describing earlier, and basically a lot of what I'll say is building on the presentation by Suhar. The pretext here on behalf of the Israeli civil administration and the Israeli authorities is that these Palestinians are present in a firing zone, right? In a military training zone. This is one of a whole list of many excuses and pretexts that are provided by the Israeli authorities for limiting, for removing, for demolishing the homes of these Palestinian communities throughout the West Bank. But in this area of the northern Jordan Valley, and I said earlier that, if I'm pointing in this direction, you can also see the houses of the Israeli settlement Bekaot. And behind me, I don't think you'll be able to see it, is another Israeli settlement called Ro'i. And in fact, if I point, I don't know if it's even visible here, there's a red sign behind me and a large trench. On that side, people who are familiar with this area is the Palestinian community of Ras al-Ahmar, not Khan al-Ahmar, Ras al-Ahmar, a community that is dealing with so much harassment and with ongoing, these repetitive temporary evacuations for Israeli military training. So this Palestinian population in these areas, they're very small herding communities, are facing, basically, like Suha described, are facing the entire pressure of the Israeli authorities, the army, the civil administration, and also in other places, a bit less in this area and slightly more a few kilometers further to the north of here, the pressure of settlers. And settlers have begun to establish these herding outposts in this area. So the new tactic, instead of building a settlement and harassing your Palestinian neighbors in order to remove them from land, over the last few years, a very effective tactic has been to create a small outpost and bring herds of sheep or goats, or in some cases cows, and herd them. And the Israeli settlers who herd these animals are very effective in terrorizing and brutalizing, in scaring off the Palestinian herders who are reliant on these areas for their own livelihood. And this is done clearly, obviously, with the full support of all of the authorities, both of the settler kind of infrastructure in this area, right, the municipal and regional councils, and also with the support of the Israeli security forces. So this is a small snapshot of the situation here in the northern Jordan Valley. Homsa, as my colleagues described, is the new site of massive pressure, and we will see, let's see what happens in the next few days. The visit today by the European Union and additional like-minded countries was done in order to convey a strong message that the EU and its member states and its allies, like the UK and the Switzerland representatives were here, are supportive of Palestinian communities in ALSC and are also and reject Israeli demolitions. They reject them as an attempt for a forcible transfer and a violation of international humanitarian law. The problem is, and this is our critique as B'Tselem, and I think many other people who are involved in work in this issue share this critique. The problem is that the European Union, even though it has stated all the correct and right statements, and it has a correct position on Israeli attempts to forcibly transfer Palestinians from their homes in ALSC, the problem is that there is never any action to back up these statements. And this is something that I think is very clear if we use Homsa as a real case study, because like I mentioned earlier, on the 3rd of November, Israel demolished the entire community. There are debates on how much of it, but four clusters of families were totally destroyed by Israeli bulldozers. And the European Union paid a visit a few days after the demolition in November as well. And the question that has to be asked, and I think this is a very important question when we're having this conversation with European audiences, and certainly in the Netherlands, with the Netherlands, again, having a very, and today the Dutch representative was also, by the way, to Palestine, was also part of this visit. The policy of the European Union and its foreign policy objective is securing the possibility for a two-state solution. I should also say that B'Tselem, my organization, does not take any particular position on a final status outcome. But if the European Union has visited Homsa after the first demolition in November, and clearly everything that the European Union said, all of the conversations they had with Israeli diplomats and the different messages that were transmitted to the Israeli authorities led to zero impact, right? Because clearly Israel has gone ahead and demolished the same community again, and is indicating very clearly that its intention is to not allow the rebuilding of this community in any meaningful way. I think it's crucial for the European Union to rethink its responses and to be very, and I'll try and say it bluntly, aware that these statements do not make any difference when it comes to the Israeli policy of forcible transfer. And I think this is a key message as far as we're concerned as an Israeli human rights organization that is monitoring this kind of Israeli action in the West Bank. This is something that I think the audiences in Europe have to make clear to their own elected officials. This is something that clearly the current reactions and the current policy or the current statements on behalf of the international community are not making an impact. So this, I think, is something that we all need to be very well aware of. I want to take a step back now and talk about the broader issue of shrinking space. And this also, I think, connects to both things that both Suha and Niels mentioned earlier. I think when we're talking about shrinking space from the Israeli perspective, so from the perspective of Israeli human rights defenders, very often what we are thinking about is attacks against us, attacks that aim to silence us, like Niels also described, the action that is meant to silence criticism or media coverage of the issues. And I think one of the clearest messages that I have always, and I've been dealing a lot with the issue of shrinking space over the last few years. And in fact, since my beginning of work in B'Tselem, we've always been under attack. Certainly it's been on the increase over the past, I suppose, 10 years. But the issue is that we are attacked, we're not attacked because of our own position. We are attacked because we are raising the issue of the occupation of Israel's annexation, de facto annexation of the West Bank. And we're attacked in order to silence any criticism of the issue. And one of the basic things we have always said when these kind of like this conversation about shrinking space was being had is that the way to deal with these attacks is not through, or is, you know, certainly there needs to be solidarity with human rights organizations, but the most important thing is to actually work on the issues. So for, you know, in this case, again, I'm talking about European countries and especially the Netherlands, the issue is Israel's policies of forcible transfer of Palestinians in the West Bank. That is why, you know, the attempts to shrink space are in order to perpetuate this occupation and perpetuate these policies. And the way to deal with shrinking space is through actual action that will get Israel to end its occupation. Now, so this is kind of like, I think, a good way of pulling all of these issues together. And one maybe final comment, I'll try and make it short, and I'll also be able to provide a lot more background if anyone's interested either in the questions and answers, but also following the webinar. If you want to email me, etc., and reach out to me, I'll be very happy to provide this information. B'Tselem, a couple of weeks ago, has issued a position paper that aims to take all of this information and all of the analysis that we have been doing, you know, for many years, for over 30 years, and really, and clearly B'Tselem has been focusing on the occupation for the entire period of its existence. But what we tried to do a couple of weeks ago is to look at the entire regime that applies to our region. So not just the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, but looking really at the essential reality that exists between the River Jordan, I'm pointing to it right now, and the Mediterranean Sea in the west, so our entire area. B'Tselem does not generally focus on human rights issues inside Israel itself, but after a really long process of consultation and thought, we realized and we reached the conclusion that it would be wrong to continue to simply look at the situation and the reality of occupation and annexation as if it's disconnected from the broader reality around the entire area that Israel controls. And we're talking about all of this region. The result is you know, a relatively short position paper that examines this entire reality and calls it what it is, calls it a regime of apartheid that is being applied by the Israeli government onto all people who live under its control. And this includes, you know, myself as an Israeli living with all of the privileges that citizens in a democracy enjoy, and the whole range of other groupings of Palestinians who are all separate in the different, in the kind of package of rights they include, but with one common denominator, which is that they are always in receipt, or they're always in enjoyment of lesser rights than Israelis. This regime of Jewish supremacy that applies to the entire area is how now we frame and we look at this reality. And I think it's very clear, and at least to us, and we obviously endeavor to try and make this clear to our audiences, that what we see on the ground in Homsa, so the small, I don't want to call them small because obviously this is devastating, what is happening now to this community on the ground. But every single Palestinian community in every single region in the West Bank and every single issue here fits into a broader picture of this broader apartheid regime. So this is something that I'm very happy, as I said, to continue to discuss. And we also have produced a lot of information and also tried to make this information accessible to varying audiences in order to really raise awareness of this, of our new analysis. I should also say that Palestinian organizations have been saying this for many years, including Al-Haq, that both Suhar and Niels were involved in. I do think there is a specificity in an Israeli organization saying that, for better and for worse. Certainly, it's not a you know, it's not the first time that this language and this analysis has been done. And certainly B'Tselem, although B'Tselem is not going to stop working on the occupation, will endeavor now in all of our work to place our analysis in this broader framing. So I think I'll finish here. And as I said, very happy to answer questions, but also to engage further if people want to email me after this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Sari. Again, there's a lot of information. It's nice that that you can give some reality from what's actually happening, especially in Hamza. So what we did is Oxfam, because we responded, and I was actually on site, I think at the beginning of December, and trying to work out what was required and what we could do. We spoke to the community and we put together a very short little film, and we just changed it a little bit and sent it all out to the international community 2 days ago. And we hope that, by everybody raising their voices, whether it's Al-Haq or B'Tselem or organisations within the Netherlands, you build up some political pressure. And I think we've reached a little bit of the impasse that the demarches and the communications are not actually changing anything on the ground. So Thomas, if it's over to you, could you show the film?
كأنه هاي المنطقة صابها زلزال ولا إشي، بعد ما كملوا الهدم كان يستفاد منه دمار شامل. كان بعد ساعتين كان نزول مطر بعدها. في عندنا عجلات ترولي على هذا بجرها التراكتور، حطينا عليها بلاستيك وقعدنا فيه. يعني بتحطم الإنسان تحطيم، إنه تشوف بيتك مهدوم، أولادك في العراء. في بنت ابني عمرها 8 شهور حطيتها في السيارة، نزلوها من السيارة وصادروا السيارة. الأولاد يعني الصغار قالوا خلونا واحد بس خزان واحد نشرب منه، قال له ممنوع، وفزر الخزانات كلها. ما كان عندنا مي نشرب، كل شيء لهم مرتب وكل شيء لهم واصل، وإحنا بالعكس ممنوعين من كل شيء، ومع ذلك ملاحقين كمان. نتمنى تمني إنه ناس تقف إلى جانبنا، تضغط على الاحتلال إنه ما يمارس هذه الممارسات الوحشية ضدنا وضد أولادنا وضد مصدر رزقنا الوحيد.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm sorry the quality wasn't fantastic, but I think you get the idea of the level of destruction and devastation that happened in November and then has happened again. And we hope something positive will come out of this. It seems to be a moment of a sort of a pinnacle moment, with the UN having released statements on this back in November, and then the action is that the Israeli military have come along and demolished it as well. So thank you to the panelists. We have a range of questions that have come in, and we'll try and get through some of these, but I'll try and work through them. There were some that were focused around the EU. One of the questions, the EU is not prepared to take any real action, so de facto leave it to Israel to do its wrongdoings. The EU was informed about the demolitions and the confiscation of the EU humanitarian assistance materials. The problem, no real and effective reaction, I mean a strong political will from the EU. And most European media are fully complicit in not telling the realities on the ground. It also said the EU are not united when it comes to voting on humanitarian issues at the UN. WHO health issues in Germany, Austria, voting against Palestinian conditions at the UN and other things. I think the question really is, what could the EU be doing more, and how could they lobby a lot stronger? So maybe I could go to Suhar and Sarit on that one. Suhar. Okay, I don't think we have Suhar. They said there was an electricity issue in Ramallah. So, Sarit, over to you. What could the EU be doing more?
Yeah, well, I mean, the EU could be doing a lot of things, but we know they're not doing. I think there is a whole range of actions that EU officials, both on the political level and also on the kind of like civil servant bureaucratic level could be done in order to clarify to Israel that this conduct is unacceptable. But the reason we're having this webinar in the first place is because the European Union, its member states, and other actors are not taking this action, right? Are preferring or reaching the conclusion that the only thing they can do is make statements rather than actually take action. And this reality of demolitions, of harm, devastating harm to people and to communities, and also like a devastating harm to the Palestinian economy and to the broader kind of benefit of all of Palestinians continues. What can we do? I mean, what can the EU do? The EU is aware of like a whole range of options. First of all, I would say real full implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2334 on differentiation, taking serious action that would actually have entail consequences, certainly not hindering the work of the International Criminal Court on these issues. There are many options available, but I think I'd rather focus on what the people we're talking to could do. And again, it's a Dutch audience, and it's I'm assuming, hoping that the people involved in this webinar have some, are involved in political activism and involved in social change activism in their own communities. And I think this is, for me, the way forward. I think we need, as I said, international EU and member states, decision makers and elected officials to understand that there is a value in supporting human rights and in rejecting forcible transfer. And it's not just about losing, being attacked by the Israel lobby or I call it the pro-occupation camp, right? There is also a pro-human rights camp that is willing to not attack, but is willing to encourage politicians and officials to simply adhere to the European Union's own foreign policy objective, which is to support creating conditions for the establishment of a Palestinian state. So I think for me, this is really about what activists can do. Activists can talk to people who represent them and explain to people who represent them that that this level of inaction, and that in their own country, they feel that the level of engagement of the particular country needs to change.
Thank you, Sarit. There's a couple of other questions, and I'll try and tie them all together. And they're all about what action and duty bearers and stakeholders can do. So one is, what would be the expectation of the neighbouring Arab countries? One is another expectation of like, how is this raised in the Knesset, and how is this brought forward in the Israeli parliamentary mechanisms? Another one is in the legal mechanisms, as well as within, can Palestinians bring this to the International Court of Human Rights? So we've got to feed the Arab neighbours, we've got what can be done within Israel itself, and also what can be done on the international scene. So Niels, do you want to come in on that first, and then maybe
I can give it a shot.
Struggling, we'll go back to Sarit.
As for I'm not going to speak on Arab countries. I would be going far beyond my own abilities. What I can say is that the routes to the legal routes available to Palestinians are exceptionally limited. We've Al-Haq, when I was there, and they have continued to support the ICC campaign to actually try to get some kind of legal remedy on the ground, has been exceptionally difficult. And when I say exceptionally difficult, I mean decades of investment into trying to get that off the ground, and enormous amounts of resources, ridiculous amounts of resistance, and it is a route that is worth taking, but it's also a very, very challenging one to go down. I'm in full agreement with Sarit on that. there is a lot more that a single country can do, and that a single group within a country can do. I saw comments come by about the IHRA definition being adopted in the Netherlands, which I find, it's exceptionally worrying. I personally am a member of the Green Left Party and tried to fight them on accepting the resolution that went through Parliament recently, and it's just not an issue, in the sense that it's not an issue in our elections. It's not going to be an issue. And what I want to stress is any action at the EU level and any action following that can only be done if individual countries do that. When I was still EU advocacy officer, we abandoned, really, to a degree, we abandoned lobbying the EU to lobby specific member states, because everything meaningful that the EU adopts has first been adopted by 5 or 6 or 7 individual member states, and then the EU can start to follow. We need to find those spaces, and those really do exist, but you see it even in our Minister of Trade has a Palestinian husband, knows Jerusalem better than many, almost anyone in the Netherlands, I would argue, and is very personally invested in it, and gets squeezed out because it's so politically toxic. Even 2 years ago, we adopted a resolution, or I pushed for a resolution that said we need to protect BDS activists' freedom of speech. Not even adopt BDS, not even call for boycotts, but simply protect their freedom of speech. And that became so toxic that we were called neo-Nazis, that we were called anti-Semites. That that pressure is really, if you're talking about what individuals can do, that's the one battle I would argue that is there, is to really push against that. I also see some questions about what we can expect from the Washington administration. This was also something that I'm very skeptical on, to be very honest. I don't see huge developments. What I do see there happening is a delayed response from the EU, and that's constantly been the case. Is finger pointing, even I mentioned the IHRA declaration that was adopted. Even when I started to discuss that, the Green Left started to say, yeah, but there's a new administration in Washington. We first need to wait and see if something comes out of that. And the time for wait and see is simply over. There is no wait and see in that regard. I'm not skeptical in terms of being hopeless, but I do think there are maybe there are issues that you can adopt that don't specifically, it sounds very strange, but you don't specifically name Israel-Palestine. Things like international trade regulations, human rights being ingrained into those as a standard and as a binding principle would help cover it. But we need to, I also see questions come by about development in Area C and such. We can't treat it like it's some kind of developing country that is resource poor or doesn't have the potential to function. It's not a development issue. It's a political issue. It's a choice to keep it like this. So that to me, I think is at the core of that. And you look at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the way they've been treating it is like it's a developing country and it's just another case of getting the right amount of money in and it'll happen. That political space needs to be created for officials to do that. So it does, and I'm going to have a little quick plea for the fact that in 6 weeks we're going to the polls and we're going to have elections. And the literal words of the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the VVD when he came into office was, "I don't want any headaches," which basically means on Israel-Palestine, don't do anything, and then I'm happy. Let's not let them get away with that. I think I'll leave it there because otherwise I can go on for a very, very long time. But yeah.
Thanks, Niels. No, that's fine. Yeah. And I think the comment that we just had from Ria, someone called Jay, is that organisations run the risk of being called anti-Semitic if they are attacking or seem to be critiquing Israeli policy. I mean, even President Obama made that comment as well. So he felt it at his level. Under the Biden administration, we're finding that the issue is they're reversing some things like the funding and the naming and stuff like that, but the general feeling on the ground is a lack of optimism that anything was going to change. I was asking what they felt before the Obama administration came in, and like, yes, we're very optimistic. And yet it's not much really changed on the ground. So Sarah, would you like to comment on the potential role or the role of the Arab states? We've had the normalization of relations with Israel. We also have the pending Israeli elections in March, and also with holding our breath to see if elections happen in Palestine as well in July.
So I think actually the first, well, certainly the first issue, all I can say, and like Niels, I certainly do not consider myself an expert on this. All I can say is that one of the kind of selling points in some sectors of these normalization agreements was that, you know, at least these countries will have some kind of clout with the Israeli authorities. They'll be able to apply some kind of pressure maybe to stop these demolitions or whatever. You know, so it's kind of, the court is still out on that level. So that's kind of like all I can say to this. What I can speak to is the Israeli position, the intra-Israeli perspective on demolitions and on forcible transfer. And I think it's not, and I think it's very depressing. It's not a very, there isn't a lot that we can do politically inside Israel. I think if we look at our current parliament, and certainly I don't have any reason to expect our future parliament to be any different. You know, we have a lot of elections. We love having elections in Israel. We're having them again and again all the time, but it's not that they lead to very clear changes in terms of kind of the division of positions in our parliament. And certainly the issue that we're talking about right now is simply not an issue for broader Israeli audiences. Generally, Israeli voters are not interested in the occupation in Palestinians, except unless it's issues related to, you know, security, etc. But when things are quiet, Palestinians are not very high on the agenda. And certainly the Israeli left and the Israeli primarily left of center or center is simply not interested in any kind of political change to end the occupation. There is an Israeli left, and there are Palestinian citizens of Israel who vote for parties that generally do care about the occupation, but those don't have a lot of political clout. What you do have currently in Israeli politics is a massive amount of pressure applied from the Israeli right. So from the pro-occupation, the pro-settlement camp. I think this is how one can see the previous elections promise made by our Prime Minister to formally annex the West Bank, right, or to formally annex Area C. I think this was aiming to appeal to settlers and their lobby. They have a strong lobby. And I think when you look, and this is one of the problems we have when we're trying to kind of like raise this issue of demolitions inside Israel. We have, there is a very strong lobby that is lobbying the authorities to go ahead and demolish, right? And confiscate and take over land and build settlements. There is a very small group of, or grouping of political forces within Israeli society that is lobbying for the opposite, right? For Palestinians to be given a fair, you know, existence in Area C, for Israel to adhere to their to its obligation to Palestinians, and the authorities themselves, right? The civil administration, the bodies that are meant to enforce all of these policies, are themselves trying to demolish as much as they can, right? So it's not as if the authorities are some kind of honest broker, right? A fair arbiter. The civil administration's role is to restrict as much as possible the ability of Palestinians to develop in Area C, right? This is, they'll deny it. They'll say that this is not the case, but this is absolutely the case. And therefore, what we have inside Israel is so much pressure to move on to, to forcibly transfer Palestinians, including a lot of political pressure within our parliament and very little counter pressure. So the only thing we can expect, unfortunately, and I say that with great sadness, I'm an Israeli living in this society. When I think about the future of our society and what this is going to amount to, I shudder. But we need international pressure because there is no effective counter pressure internally. So this is, unfortunately, I think what we also have to expect for the coming elections, as well as for the previous one. And then there was also a question, I think, among for panelists, and I can maybe bring this in as well. Another issue that is being raised is what the legal system is doing, right? What the Israeli court system is doing against this. I mean, when I look at what is happening on the ground, it seems like just a great injustice, right? The poorest and most disenfranchised Palestinians, these are people who are really working, they spend their entire life working from the moment they wake up, very early in the morning till the second they drop off to sleep at night, work really hard in order to subsist on basically on agriculture and on grazing herds. And when I look at what is done to them in my name, it's absolutely shameful as an Israeli. But it's very clearly not something that when the Israeli courts look at, they think there's anything problematic with it. All of these Israeli policies of demolishing the homes of these Palestinian communities in Area C have been approved by the Israeli authorities and have been approved by the Israeli High Court again and again and again. The High Court allows demolition. It provides with legal justifications for these demolitions. I should also say, and this is as an aside, a similar thing happens when it comes to the eviction notices that are placed by settler associations against Palestinian families in East Jerusalem, right? It's not the exact same dynamic, but it's very, very similar. It's Israeli courts approving and sanctioning the use of different legal tools in order to demolish and remove Palestinians from their homes and forcibly transfer them. So unfortunately, and I think there's agreement by most of the international community on this, the Israeli courts are not going to resolve this issue and are not going to help protect the rights of Palestinians in these areas.
Thank you, Suhar. We have quite a lot of questions come through, and we only have about 10 minutes left. There was one question about the activities of companies within the settlements and then within the occupied West Bank. Someone mentioned Booking.com, which is on the UN database, and I think it's registered in Holland as well. Niels, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think what I can and can't say about Booking, but no, Booking is it's an interesting case because it's been under attack here for a number of things. It was also recently with COVID regulations. It has been involved in tax evasion and still striking up a lot of money from the government when it came to when COVID hit and they were hit. So they're not in a very positive light in general here. I do think as much as the blacklist hasn't been this kind of end all and be all of the solution, I do think it was a positive step that it was taken. I do think it has helped, at least in the Netherlands, in terms of the lobby. It became easier to point to these specific companies. It is theoretically possible to take them to court in the Netherlands for their violations on the ground. Booking has been particularly difficult, however, because of its own construction. It doesn't own any of the hotels, so it isn't technically in the settlements, but the hotels that then are put on their site are, which means there's just a level of separation that is fair to criticize and absolutely fair to say that they are complicit and supporting, but legally very difficult to prove. I know that there are now efforts to look at money laundering as a possible route to take at least certain companies on in this situation that are registered in the Netherlands. But again, I think I do think we need more of a blanket situation. You're not going to be able to keep up with individual cases, as much as they're very valuable for media purposes and for keeping the energy going. There's simply too many of them to be able to keep up with each individual one. It's like the demolitions that Sarit is pointing out. One or two get picked up in the media in a very big way, but there's so many that go under the radar that doesn't really stem the flow. We need binding regulations that companies are forced to introduce human rights regulations into their situation. We need to, I think the apartheid situation that Sarit has been pointing out, and the fact that B'Tselem has adopted that is incredibly powerful. But we need more, you'd be surprised how many politicians in the Netherlands don't know that apartheid is a legal term and just only know it as just as a South African situation. So when you mention it, the only argument I get back is, yeah, but it's not exactly the same. So the general awareness of that situation needs to be upped incredibly. And I think if you were to successfully introduce apartheid as an accepted view on what's going on in the ground, then you can really start to put pressure on companies, because we've seen for people in the Netherlands who were here around the South African apartheid, we know the outspun posters of with the oranges. We know the campaign that follows, and we know that hurts. And that's why it's so toxic to touch it, and why the pushback is so hard. But I would rest if I were to have to bet on a horse right now, I think those are the two best bets you have, are successfully introducing the apartheid narrative and introducing binding regulations for companies to have to adhere to, in terms of making tangible efforts that a single country could do.
Thank you, Niels. Yeah, I mean, it's quite galling as a British citizen to see a JCB digger right at the beginning of the footage, and JCB is on the UN database, and JCB is a British company, and all companies that are on the UN database were forewarned that we're going to be on the database as well. So, but they also have that level of separation where it's not a JCB operation, and maybe they've sold the digger to a third party, but it's still their logo all over it. So it's a very tricky legal position for everybody to be in, and of course, when it's tricky, then there's wiggle room as well. I think the last question we're going to just focus is that, of course, we're in a pandemic. So what that means right now is that Israel is in lockdown. I think there was a decision this afternoon whether it be extended or not, which I've not heard about. Schools are closed, East Jerusalem, but it's quite a loose lockdown in some respects. There's been flouting of the lockdown by certain groups in Israel. In the West Bank, it's been a lot looser, but there's been a significant impact. We also have about 100,000 West Bankers and more coming over to Israel and working. You also have Gaza in a lockdown as well. And even in my own office, unfortunately, we've had an outbreak that's taken out a third of the staff in the last week, which has been quite heartening. And someone said, how does that impact on civil society voice and space in the pandemic? So Sarit and Niels, we'll take these as the last question, and any thoughts. It's a shame Suhar isn't still with us. Unfortunately, she dropped off, but she was also given a diplomatic briefing on the state of the COVID response within the West Bank as well. And I'll just plug that there is an event tomorrow, which I'll be speaking at, organised by Search for Common Ground, again online, which will be talking about vaccinations and the COVID response here in occupied territories. So Sarit, over to you, and then to Niels, and then I'll try and wrap up.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the COVID, so first of all, I should say that in the first phase of the pandemic, so like March or April, Israel did actually make a statement that was quite disingenuous even at the time about refraining from demolitions of residential structures, right? Even at the time when it was asked about humanitarian infrastructure and anything other than actual residential homes, it clarified that this is not going to change, that it will continue to demolish this. And even that commitment was, reneged on, or simply like just left to kind of like just disappear once the first lockdown was eased. Now we're in our third lockdown, I'm actually allowed to go out to the field, and we're obviously following distancing rules. But like, as you know, as Shane described it, where our society is in lockdown, yet still in the midst of this terrible pandemic, and especially when it comes to these very vulnerable Palestinian communities, there are ongoing demolitions. It's simply staggering. The Israeli authorities should have announced a moratorium on demolitions of their own volition. Clearly, they have no interest in doing this. And again, also, all of those people who are perpetrating these demolitions, right, implementing a confiscation or a demolition, they're all contract workers, right? So some of them are quite young bulldozer drivers or actual day laborers that do contract work. They're all basically being employed as essential workers in the midst of a pandemic to demolish homes of people. It's shocking. So this is one point. There hasn't been any reasonable, acceptable adherence to the needs, the humanitarian needs. The second issue is that we as Israelis have had a very high vaccination rate, where vaccines are available to all Israelis and to all Palestinian citizens of Israel and East Jerusalemites who receive Israeli healthcare. We have a great socialized healthcare system that is clearly underfunded for many years, but still operating well enough to provide vaccines for the majority of the Israeli population, and to provide follow-up and to allow all of this to happen. I'm very happy to have myself and my family and friends all vaccinated. We're all going through this process. But Palestinians living under Israeli control in the West Bank and in Gaza are not getting access to the same level of healthcare. And this, again, this is something that I find absolutely shameful as an Israeli, enjoying this healthcare system that we have, while people who are literally living under our direct control are not able to access this. The Palestinian Authority has stated that it will provide some vaccines. I think it can provide maybe 20% of the needs of the population. Israel said that it will donate 5,000 vaccines to medical staff, which is also kind of framed as this kind of humanitarian gesture or favor. But this is, and I think it's important, maybe someone can post a link to the statement by Israeli human rights organizations, coordinated and initiated by our colleagues from Physicians for Human Rights Israel, calling and talking about the obligation that the Israeli authorities have to provide this kind of healthcare and these vaccinations to all Palestinians. And this, as I said, includes Gaza as well. And this certainly, the other authorities controlling Palestinians like Hamas and Israel have obligations as well. But Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, have obligations as well. But this is not something that Israel can shirk simply by saying that, while we're not controlling anything anymore, the Oslo Accords just allow us to establish this Palestinian Authority, and that's their responsibility.
Thank you, Saad. Yeah, I said tomorrow's event is very much focused on, it's got a peace angle and post and conflict resolution angle, but be able to talk in a little bit more length about what the implications are for the Palestinian Authority and who's hiding behind the Accords and the Geneva Convention as well. But Niels, final word from yourself before I wrap up.
Yeah, I don't have very much to add to Saad's plea. I think for something I want to remind people in the Netherlands is that it's in our that international law is ingrained in our constitution. Yesterday, for no apparent reason, I was rewatching the 2010 Congress by the Christian Democrats on whether or not to go into a coalition with one of our populist far right parties. And Dries van Acht mentioned that this is our foundation, that this is what the Netherlands was built on for a great deal, and that it was the foundation of also our economic principles of trade, and that we've completely abandoned that route. And it is high time, in my opinion, to remind people that international law is not a set of guidelines. It is something that means something to people on the ground, and that upholding those are not remedial measures. They are a baseline on which we are supposed to be able to conduct ourselves. It's not a privilege to be able to be vaccinated. It's not a privilege to be allowed to do trade, to control your own borders, to decide whether or not you can live where you live and to have access to water and electricity. Those aren't privileges that are supposed to be humanitarian aid. Those are simply said rights. And it would be possible for the Palestinian people to be self-sufficient with a very well-functioning economy if these regulations were lifted. And I don't know how to say that more clearly. And I think Pax, the Rights Forum, Oxfam, Amnesty, all have very clear, B'Tselem, Al-Haq, all have very clear recommendations for what European countries can and can't do. And I don't think it's the responsibility of the human rights community to be creative for politicians to figure out. It's not our job to figure out how politicians can implement that. It's our job to remind them that those are obligations that they signed on to. And it's their job to uphold those standards.
Thank you, Niels. I think from Oxfam's perspective, just on all of this, it's really difficult. We've been here for many decades, and somehow we're very embedded in what happens. We provide humanitarian support, we provide development support. In some ways, we support the status quo, and yet we're at the same time trying to break the status quo. And as we try and challenge what we feel is just fundamentally unjust and moral, it comes at a cost. It comes at a time and resource and effort and marginalization, but it's worth it. I think it's really worth it. And my call is to any of the people left on listening to us is that it can't stop, because what happens here undermines all international humanitarian law across the world. And then if it's not upheld in one country, then it's been undermined everywhere else as well. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Pax for asking me to moderate. I'm very honored to share the forum with Niels, Sarit, and with Suhar today. I hope that we get another opportunity to talk to you. Maybe we can do it on a specific issue. We could do it, maybe give you an update on Hamza possibly, and see if we've had some positive progress, and then we'll continue to apply pressure. We'll hope that we could even push that there might be parliamentary questions on Hamza in the Netherlands in the future. We released a statement. I'm sure there'll be other statements out there. Please follow what's happening. If you feel that you can contribute in any way, shape or form, then it's always warmly welcome as well. So wishing you a wonderful evening, and thank you for listening to us, and hopefully we'll get to speak to you again. Thank you very much.